Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Ryan Sandell, and welcome to the 12th week of this Introduction to Phonology at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität München. In the last several weeks of this course, the last 3 weeks to be more precise, we will finally be looking into phonological phenomena that go above the level of the segment. Thus far, the phonological processes that we've studied have involved essentially exclusively interactions between segments. Say, for instance, let's say we have an underlying sequence X and Y, and we can have some processes whereby X impacts Y or Y impacts X. Or in a few rarer cases, we've seen instances in which some segments may act on each other at a distance. For instance, if we have a sequence of two vowels separated by a consonant, we've seen some processes of vowel harmony, for instance, whereby properties of a following vowel might affect a preceding vowel, for instance. Today, we're going to start by looking at how segments may be organized into larger groups inside of a word, that is so-called syllables. So for today, I've asked you to read 2 chapters on syllabification from Hayes' textbook and Tracy Allen Hall's textbook. And then next week, we'll be turning to the process, to the topic of stress rules, namely, how do we know which syllable or vowel in a word is the receives the stress, as we would say. There are a variety of terms, but we'll talk about that next week. This week, for those of you following the course here, the 5th homework assignment will be uploaded on Wednesday this week, and it will be due in a week as usual. So let's begin by trying to discuss just what a syllable is, defining that more precisely. You've probably encountered the term in a somewhat informal way outside of courses on linguistics. But let's try to build up now to a more precise definition of what a syllable is and how syllables come to be formed. So, as I've said, thus far in our course, we can imagine that the phonological sequences that we've been interested in consist of sequences of feature matrices that have morphosyntactic constituent structure. So when we've talked about bounding domains, those bounding domains reference morphosyntactic units like the stem, the word, phrases, and entire utterances. So let's imagine the English phrase, calling home. Here we have some sets of features defining each of those segments, calling home, and then we see that these words can be broken down into one word has a complex morphosyntactic structure. There's a stem call with a suffix, an inflectional suffix ing, whereas the other one has a simple morphosyntactic structure, just a single stem organized into a word, and these two words together build a phrase. So our first step is going to be to enrich our representations, that is, make our representations a little more complicated by adding a purely phonological layer of constituent structure, the level of the syllable, where we say that these segments, at the level of the segments, some segments form a group together to the exclusion of other segments. And each of those groupings we will call a syllable. So in the syllabification, the English language syllabification that I've proposed for the phrase calling home, we have 3 syllables, one consisting of the 2 segments ka and the vowel o. So we have a syllable call, a second syllable ling, these 3 segments organized together, and a third syllable home. And in this case, this entire syllable corresponds to the entire stem and the entire morphosyntactic word. When we look at this diagram, which shows both segmental structure at the sort of lowest level, and then above it morphosyntactic structure, and below it the syllable structure, we can stop and think for a minute why it might be a bit strange to put the syllable layer directly above the feature matrices here. That is, if we somehow inserted the syllabic information here between the segments and the stem. In a sense, that would be weird because that would be mixing, combining 2 different levels of representation. That is, above the individual segments here, we're talking about morphosyntactic structure. These boundaries of stem and word correspond to morphological structure and syntactic structure, whereas below here, these syllables correspond to some purely phonological groupings. That is, the syllables don't necessarily need to correspond to the morphosyntactic organization. And we can see that quite clearly in the word calling here, where although the segment L here in calling belongs to the morphosyntactic stem of the word calling, it's part of a separate syllable. So the phonological layer doesn't always perfectly overlap, doesn't always perfectly map onto or correspond to the morphosyntactic structure. If that were the case, then it might be acceptable, for instance, to put those syllables here above the segments, but that's not the case. Now, if we concentrate just on the phonological organization of those segments, the organization of those segments into phonological structures, then it would be more usual to draw the syllables above the segments. So here are our segments in the phrase calling home once again, and we see that I've used this symbol, this Greek sigma, to mark each of those syllables, what I labeled as a syllable up here. And we can consider that these syllables belong to phonological words as well. So this can be a bit confusing because we will consider there to be both a word in the morphosyntactic sense, and we'll also say that there is a word in the phonological sense. Usually, in the vast majority of cases, we can simply assume that the morphosyntactic word and the phonological word do perfectly overlap, and that will continue to be the case for the remaining weeks of this course. But if you study further phonology in your life, you'll see some instances in which this perfect distinction of morphosyntactic word and phonological word becomes a bit more complicated. So now that we've seen our first syllabification diagrams, as we might call this diagram of the phrase calling home, let's clarify some examples and terms. So these diagrams are often called diagrams of so-called prosodic structure, and here the adjective prosodic simply means that we are talking about phonological information above and beyond the segments. And in such diagrams, the word, when we mean the word as a phonological unit, that's often labeled with a Greek omega. But for today, we're going to simply generally omit the word level above syllables. And so we can just imagine that the word level is there. And for the most part, we'll just be looking at syllabification inside of individual words and not across larger phrases. And as you can see in this diagram, the level of the syllable is generally abbreviated with a Greek sigma. So let's see if I have my Greek letters. So here's a sigma that I can type. So if I represented the sequence of structure with 3 sigmas, that would mean that I'm talking about a phonological word containing 3 syllables. Now, here comes the bit of terminology that breaks down the syllable into some more precise and fine-grained units. So the core of every syllable, the part that bears the feature plus syllabic, which we've always used, that's referred to as the nucleus. So in our words here, each syllable necessarily has a nucleus, and we have 3 vowels, a, I, and o, in these English words, and each of those are plus syllabic segments, and we count those as the syllable nuclei for each of those 3 syllables. So we have 3 syllable nuclei here. Inside of the same syllable, any segments that come before the nucleus or to the left of the nucleus are called an onset. So the segments ka, la, and ha would be syllable nuclei. And anything that comes after the syllable nucleus, we refer to as codas or coda segments. So in this first syllable, ka, we see there are no consonants, no other segments coming after the syllable nucleus, a. So we say that there are no coda segments. In the second syllable, we have a velar nasal coming after the vowel. So there's 1 coda consonant. And here we have a labial nasal in the word home, in that one syllable. So that's a coda consonant too. So we can say, if we look at this phrase again, we have the nucleus. We have the following nuclei: the vowel A, the vowel I, and the vowel O. Let's just copy this, see if I can copy this vowel in here. And then the onsets, we notice that each of these syllables has an onset. There's a ka, a la, and a ha in an onset. And the codas are in the first syllable, there's no coda. Maybe I can write that as empty. And in the second syllable, there's an and in the third syllable, there's a labial nasal. Okay, so those are the core pieces of terminology. So let's now carry out a small exercise in using a few more English words or further words of English: act, clap, straw, and cantaloupe, identifying the onset, nucleus, and coda of each syllable in each case. So I'll wait a few seconds before I talk about each word so that you have time to think to yourself about which segments constitute nuclei, which segments constitute codas, which segments constitute onsets, and so on. Let's begin with act. So in this case, we have just a single syllable, as I've labeled it. So which segment is plus syllabic? Here, the vowel a is a plus syllabic segment. So the nucleus in the word act must be the vowel a. And are there any consonants preceding it, any segments preceding it? No, so the onset is empty, empty onset. And following that a in the same syllable, we have two consonants, a velar stop and a alveolar stop, both voiceless. So we have what we would call in this case, a complex coda. So the terms complex coda and complex onset simply mean that the onset or the coda contain more than one segment. And we can contrast those with a simple onset or a simple coda, meaning that the onset or coda contains only a single segment. Now, let's look to the word clap. Once again, we have a word, a phonological word consisting of just a single syllable, and we have one plus syllabic segment. Once again, a nucleus with the vowel a. In this case, there are some segments preceding the plus syllabic segment, a voiceless velar stop and a lateral approximant. So in this case, we have a complex onset. The onset of that syllable is kla, and this would be a case of a complex onset because it contains more than one segment. And the coda consists of a voiceless labial stop. In the word straw, now, what do we see? Once again, a phonological word consisting of just a single syllable with one plus syllabic segment, the vowel a. Here's our. And if I look to the right of this vowel, I notice that there are no segments following it, so there's no coda whatsoever. On the other hand, there is an onset with 3 segments. Rather complex onset consisting of the sequence stra, stra, and no coda whatsoever in this case. Now finally, we come to a word that's a bit more complex, the word cantaloupe, this fruit. This word I would syllabify as follows. I would divide it up into 3 syllables. Thus far, we haven't said anything about how we might decide where the boundaries are between the syllables. We'll just take my syllabifications as given here. And here, in the first syllable, we have a nucleus a. In the second syllable, a nucleus schwa. And in the third syllable, diphthong o. The first syllable has both an onset and a coda, onset ka and coda n, coronal nasal. The second syllable has no coda, but has one consonant, a voiceless alveolar stop preceding it, ta. And in the third syllable, there's both an onset and a coda again, la and pa. And all of the onsets and codas in all of the syllables here are simple. There's not more than one consonant in either the onset or the coda there. Now, besides drawing tree diagrams like these, we can, of course, also represent the structure using labeled brackets. So the word cantaloupe with 3 syllables, we could also draw this way with each group of segments enclosed between brackets. And if I want to be explicit that these are all part of the same word, I can add another bracket around them, and that would correspond to the further level of the word above the level of the syllable. And very often in phonetic transcription, if we're not talking so precisely about, or we're not focusing on syllable structure so much, but we still want to give that information, then it could be typical to represent the syllable boundaries just using a period. So in this case, I'm using the brackets here to mean that we're looking at a phonetic transcription, and the periods here are simply giving the reader the information that there are syllable boundaries here. Okay, now that we've met our first pieces of core terminology, the distinction between nucleus, onset, and coda, and we've seen a few examples, we'll pause, and when we come back, we'll try to answer a few more questions about what role syllabification plays and how we can try to build up syllable structure by just looking at a sequence of segments.